Well, welcome everybody. Celebrate Recovery. I'm a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, and I'm very grateful for that. He has saved me, and I still struggle with love, abandonment issues, low self-esteem, and anger. And my name is Bob. Well, tonight we are going to have another testimony, as we usually do in between lessons. Normally we watch testimonies from Saddleback Church. As you know, they have a lot of really great testimonies, and I know most of you have seen them, and they really communicate the essence of Celebrate Recovery. Testimonies are very encouraging because, Celebrate Recovery is a year program. It takes time, and sometimes it can be a grind. Sometimes we feel discouraged and feel overwhelmed and tired. And so a good testimony can really provide encouragement. And so that's why we do testimonies. We do lots of them here at Creekside. At Celebrate Recovery. Well, tonight we're going to have a live testimony, and it's going to be me. I know some of you have heard my testimony before. So if you have, please bear with me. I have changed a few things. There has been some things that have happened since the last time I gave my testimony. And so hopefully it'll make it more interesting. So let's begin with that. I was born in Globe, Arizona, which is a small mining community approximately 90 miles east of Phoenix. Several years later, my family moved to an Air Force base, Williams Air Force Base, which was about 30 miles south of Phoenix, near a town called Chandler. My dad had taken a job as a house painter for the United States Air Force. We had moved into a brand new 2-bedroom house on the base. Base was still actually under construction. I still remember the new smell of the house and the wood shavings that were still on the floor. When I was 7 years old, I went to a little country grammar school that was located approximately halfway between the Air Force Base and Chandler. And I still remember the first day of school and how scared I was. Didn't know what I was supposed to do, didn't know where I was supposed to be, I didn't know which class I was supposed to be in. And I remember how embarrassed I was about all this, but somehow it worked out, and I ended up in first grade class. It didn't take very long before the teacher decided that I was too advanced for the class, and I was moved to second grade. My mother had been homeschooling me before I went to school, so I guess I was ahead of everybody in the first grade. Now, even though this was a positive experience, I still felt fearful and uncomfortable, but I never communicated this to my parents because I felt too ashamed at being scared. Looking back on it now, I'm sure my mother would have listened and been sympathetic, but I remember my dad as being very stern and very remote and almost unapproachable, so I just kept everything to myself. The following year, a grammar school was opened on the Air Force Base, and I was enrolled in the third grade. My mother was extremely protective, and she insisted that I wear hiking boots to school because she thought they would provide me with good ankle support. Well, this didn't really bother me, but the other kids noticed it, and they began making fun of me. And this got me into numerous fights with the other boys. Now, I didn't really like fighting, so I tried to avoid them wherever I could. But I remember one time when I was fighting one of my tormentors in the middle of the playground. Of course, this attracted a lot of attention, and one of my teachers came over. I fully expected her to break it up, but instead she just stood there and watched. And periodically she would give me suggestions on how to better fight this kid, because I wasn't doing very well. I remember being very angry and humiliated at the same time. During these years, my father contracted cancer. I remember him being sick most of the time. Finally, when he couldn't work any longer, we moved to Chandler, and there my mother went to work in a restaurant as a waitress. She didn't make very much money, and we barely got by. In the meantime, my father got progressively worse. I remember him being in lots of pain, and every once in a while he would ask me to give me one of his pain shots, which I really didn't want to do. I was not a good shot giver, and every time I gave him an injection, he would wince with pain. Finally, my father succumbed to cancer when I was 10 years old. My mother did the best she could to earn a living during this time, and I remember she took in ironing from the local cleaners. We moved into a low-income housing complex in Chandler, And I can still remember the squalid conditions and the feeling that we were at the very, very bottom of society. One year at Christmas time, I remember going to the local Firestone store every day where they had a wonderful display of Lionel trains. They were really beautiful, all different cars and engines and tracks and all that stuff. And I just loved to go there and look at them and fantasize. I really wanted one of those trains so bad. I remember my younger brother saved his pennies and bought me a little plastic engine with a couple of cars as his Christmas present to me. He was so proud. I remember I was so bitterly disappointed. Well, this went on for the next 2 years until my mother contracted breast cancer. And when she couldn't finally work any longer, the local priest, Catholic church, I was going to a Catholic grammar school at the time, put us in a little apartment adjacent to the church. Shortly after that, my mother died. But before she passed away, she gave me some instructions on how to contact my aunt, her sister, in California. I remember calling my aunt and telling her that Mom had died. Long pause on the end of the phone. And finally she said, "Well, I guess that means we'll have to come and get you." Approximately a week later, one of my cousins showed up to take my brother back to California, my brother and I back to California. My cousin told us to just get our clothes and leave the rest. We didn't have very much, to be sure, so it didn't seem like a big deal to me at the time. However, reflecting back on it, I wish we had taken a little more time to look things over a little better. When we came to California, we lived on a 640-acre ranch, which is actually owned by my cousin. My aunt and her daughter also lived there, and at this point I was 12 years old and my brother was 10. My brother and I were treated as outsiders right from the beginning. It was really obvious that the family didn't want us and that we were considered to be an imposition. Actually, we were treated pretty much as hired hands. We had lots and lots of chores to do, including milking 3 cows twice a day, helping with 300 head of sheep, helping with planting and harvesting of grain. And in spite of all the work we did, we were continuously ostracized from the family. We weren't even allowed to use the bathroom facilities in the house. We had to use an outdoor outhouse, and we had to rely on sponge baths in the back porch using a wash tray for personal hygiene. We also washed our clothes on the back porch using a washboard, even though a brand new washing machine was standing close by. During this time, I went to a high school that was approximately 20 miles away. I went back and forth to school on a bus provided by the school district. This arrangement precluded me from participating in school activities that required staying after school. And so I remember feeling isolated and alone and different. And what made it particularly hurtful was that my aunt's daughter was allowed to do some of these things, and they made arrangements to provide her the necessary transportation. Well, after approximately 3 years of this kind of treatment, my brother and I had become quite rebellious, as you can imagine. I remember one incident in the barn where my cousin was angry with my brother for something that he did, can't remember what it was, and he was threatening to hit him. I was standing above both of them in the loft area of the barn, and I was holding a pitchfork. I told my cousin, I said, "Frank," and he looked up at me and I says, "Back off, or I'm going to run you through with this pitchfork." And I really meant it, and he knew I meant it. I mean, he looked into my eyes, and he knew that I was serious. Fortunately, he backed off. However, several days later, we were turned over to the state of California as wards of the court, and we were classified as incorrigibles. Now, I don't think the state really knew what to do with us at the time, so they put us in juvenile hall as a temporary holding place. My brother and I were put into isolation for approximately 3 weeks until foster homes could be found for us. I was eventually put into a foster home which was owned by a school teacher named Ruth. Ruth lived alone as she had lost her husband several years prior, and my brother was placed in another foster home not too far away with a very nice family. This was the first time that we'd ever been apart. The good news was that the 2 foster homes were close enough together so we could see each other often. However, it was very difficult for both of us. So one day, after 6 months had passed by, my brother came by and he asked Ruth if he could move in with me and her. And joy of joys, she said yes. so my brother and I were reunited. Now, Ruth was a very hurting woman. She was still grieving the loss of her husband. And as a result, she suffocated me with her love and attention. There are times when it got even close to being inappropriate. Now, this was confusing to me, and I really didn't know what I should do, especially since I was a teenage boy with raging hormones. However, I hung in there, did the best I could, and finished my senior year of high school. As soon as I graduated, I went off to college. I had applied to a number of different schools and was accepted to University of San Francisco, and I severed my ties with Ruth. This was difficult because now I was truly alone, and Ruth was deeply, deeply hurt. In addition, my brother and I had drifted apart. He was still in high school, and he was primarily interested in girls and sports. So our basis for our relationship changed immediately. As I began my college career, I looked for other relationships to fill the void that I was feeling. I desperately was looking for a girlfriend, but I was very awkward and often too eager, so I experienced a lot of rejection. Eventually, there was one girl who did show some interest, but she had so many personal issues that she was incapable of having any kind of relationship. In addition to my relationship problems, my life was further complicated financially. I was working my way through college, and so most of the time I had no money. At one point, things got so bad financially that I decided to quit. At that time, I was working for the Franchise Tax Board as a clerk, stock clerk. And the director of the San Francisco operations heard about my decision, amazingly. And he came to me personally and counseled me against quitting. I was so blown away that this man of such high position would take any kind of interest in me at all. So I decided to take his advice and try and stay in school as best I could. Somehow I was able to stay in school, and I continued until my senior year. And when I only had one semester to go, once again I ran out of money. So I decided once again to drop out and work for a semester in order to accumulate enough funds to finish. One of my teachers heard about this and offered to co-sign a loan for me so that I could borrow enough money to finish the semester. Once again, I was so blown away that someone would do this for me. So I accepted my teacher's offer and borrowed the money, was able to finish the semester and graduate. During my senior year, I met a woman who I became interested in. She was a pretty redhead, and she seemed to be interested in me as well. And we dated and eventually became serious. However, the U.S. Army, was looming on the horizon, because in those days the Vietnam War was still well underway and the draft was going strong. So as soon as I graduated from college, I was in the Army. Fortunately, I didn't have to go to Vietnam. Came close several times. My unit was activated, and when I was ready to go, but fortunately I didn't have to go. And so I actually ended up spending all my active duty time at Fort Ord, California, near Monterey. This was a great duty assignment for obvious reasons, and it enabled me also to continue seeing my girlfriend. When I was finally discharged from active duty, my girlfriend and I got married, and things went well for the first 5 years of our marriage. I went to work for AT&T in a management training program. We moved to Marin County, and we had 3 children. However, in the 5th year of our marriage, my wife began having serious bouts of depression. We began seeing a psychiatrist, and she was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Extensive therapy followed for a number of years during that time she underwent many electroshock treatments with only modest results. She was virtually catatonic, couldn't really do much, and spent most of the time in bed. And during that time, she attempted to commit suicide 4 times, and she succeeded on her 5th attempt. And at the time, our children were ages 6 and 8 and 10. As you can imagine, that was an extremely difficult time for me. I always had this premonition that sooner or later that my wife was going to take her life, that she would ultimately be successful. And the 4 times that she attempted to commit suicide, I always had a premonition. I would get there just in the nick of time. I'd take her to the hospital, and they would just revive her just in the nick of time. However, on the fifth occasion, I didn't make it in time. When I came home, I found the bedroom door was locked. I broke down the door, I found her in bed, and she was already dead. I called 911 immediately. It's amazing how quickly they responded, and they took her away. In the meantime, I called the kid's grandmother, told them what was going on, and she came to find the kids. My wife had made arrangements to have the three kids, go to their friends' houses, and I pretty much knew where they were, so I told the grandmother where to go get them. And in the meantime, I followed my wife to the hospital, and when I got there, they told me that she was gone. I came home, and the three little kids were there. That was very difficult. I didn't know really what to say, to my kids, and I said, finally, we gathered together, and they were wondering what was going on, and I said, well, guys, I got some bad news. I said, the angels have come and taken your mother home to heaven. I was not a Christian at the time, and I really didn't know what to say. And they just looked at me with these blank looks in their faces and hardly any emotion, and finally my little daughter said, does that mean she's dead? I said, yes, Kira, she's dead. And then they all cried. I thought that I was prepared for that eventual possibility, but as it turned out, I wasn't. I was a mess, and I really didn't know what to do. I remember calling my brother and telling him what had happened, and he immediately took time off from his job. He just dropped everything that he was doing, and he spent a solid week with me every day, practically 24/7. He helped me so much. I am so grateful to him for that. And during that time, I decided that I had to continue working for AT&T and focus on raising my three kids. I also decided that I didn't want to get involved in another relationship, at least right away, even though I felt hurt and alone and isolated. So I hired a housekeeper to take care of the household, and I just moved ahead. This plan worked okay for a while, until something monumental happened that changed my life. I met a terrific woman named Gail. A mutual friend had offered to introduce me to her, and I really didn't want to at first. I didn't really like this mutual friend very well, and so I felt any friend of hers would not be somebody that I would want to know. And actually, Gail knew her too, and she didn't like her either, and she was thinking the same thing. But she kept pestering me, so finally I agreed. I said, okay, I'll meet your friend. And I'm sure glad I did, because Gail was the most incredible woman I had ever known. She was sweet, intelligent, beautiful, erudite, beautiful, loving, kind, and she was beautiful. She was everything that I could ever imagine in a woman. And the best part, she had no psychological problems. So we began seeing each other. The attraction was magnetic. We were immediately drawn to each other. We were so compatible, it didn't take very long to forget about my decision to avoid getting into another relationship. Approximately 4 months after meeting her, I proposed to her. Imagine that. Can you imagine, what was I thinking? After 5 months, and after 5 months we got married. Anyway, Gail had 2 daughters. They were 8 years old and 13, and of course I still had my 3. So we amalgamated 2 families. We were now the Brady Bunch. Let me tell you, bringing 2 families together was a very interesting experience. There were many joys, and there was also many sorrows as we grew together as a family. We had many, many tests. For example, my oldest son, he decided to run away from home. He decided he hated Gail, couldn't stand her, and he decided to get into drugs and all kinds of other things. And he got to the point where he was you could virtually not talk to him. He was just incommunicado, couldn't talk to him, and so he ran away. And praise the Lord, I was able to track him down and bring him back. That's a whole other interesting story. My young son, who decided to become a drug dealer, and that lasted for a short time until we busted him. 2 of my daughters decided to steal a neighbor's car and go joyriding at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were 14 at the time. They might have gotten away with it, except that they ran a red light going 40 miles an hour right in front of a policeman who happened to be right there watching the whole thing. In addition to all this, there were several other auto accidents which totaled 3 cars. Fortunately, no one was hurt. There were many other incidents as well. In fact, there was a time when all 5 kids were teenagers at the same time. That was pure insanity. Gail and I could literally write a book. Good news is they're all still alive today, and so is Gail and I. We actually made it. During this time, our neighbor across the street, who was a Christian, saw what was going on at our house, and she invited Gail to go to a women's retreat in Mission Springs. Gail went, and it was there that she accepted the Lord into her life. She came home and informed us that we were going to go to church. Well, that was okay with me because I had been raised in the Catholic Church and thought religion was a good thing. And I thought it would probably be good for the kids as well. So we started going to First Covenant Church in Oakland, and I immediately became fascinated with the preaching. I had never heard preaching like that before. It was all about problems of life and how to deal with them using a relationship with somebody called Jesus Christ. It was all about having this incredible relationship with God, and I began to see how relevant the Bible was. And after about 6 months, I prayed to receive Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. About this time, I was still working for AT&T. They decided to reorganize, and they began downsizing the company. Many positions at my job level were being consolidated or eliminated. The company offered me the choice of staying on in a lower-paying job or leave. And if I left, they offered me a year's wages and a vested pension. So after much thought and prayer, I chose to leave. That was a very scary decision, I have to tell you. The economy was in terrible shape. Unemployment was high, kind of like it is today. I had 5 kids and a wife to support and a large home in the Oakland Hills to pay for. And needless to say, I was terrified. So I decided to do the safest thing I could do in this kind of economic environment. Decided to start my own business. I figured that since I had a year's wages, I had a year to make a go of it. And I decided to go into the real estate investment business. I'd been a real estate investor for quite a few years, and so it just seemed like a natural choice. However, it was the worst time to get into this kind of business because interest rates were at 20% at the time. But the good news is that there was a lot of properties available because nobody was buying or selling anything. So I managed to find a few properties that penciled out, even at 20% interest, and I formed partnerships and bought them, and that inaugurated my investment business. Well, my business lasted for approximately 10 years, and things went pretty well. I remember one day I was having my quiet time, and I told the Lord that I didn't think I was being used by Him in the most fruitful way. I remember telling Him that I was available to use any way He wanted. Wow. Can you imagine that? You probably heard it said that we should be careful what we pray for. In this case, I was totally unprepared for what was about to happen. Almost immediately, my business came to a halt. About that time, the government decided to enact new tax laws which took away tax incentives for real estate partnerships, the business that I was in. All of a sudden, investors were not interested in real estate, and I couldn't raise a dime of capital. As bad as that was, the earthquake of 1987 really hurt my business. I was a major owner, I should say, in a 98-unit apartment building near Lake Merritt in Oakland. And the earthquake destroyed the underpinnings of the building. The city condemned the building, and I had to immediately evacuate all the tenants. And as you can imagine, that had a chilling effect on my cash flow as well as my balance sheet. That day, I lost all the equity I had in the building, which was substantial. I lost it all, and I couldn't believe what was happening. From that point on, life became increasingly miserable. I lost all my other buildings through foreclosure. Properties that had been good performing properties turned into poor performing properties. I was sued by several lenders, and I battled lawsuits for the better part of 2 years. I remember one time I was in the courtroom battling one lawsuit, and things were just not going well for me at all. And finally, out of frustration, I stood up, and I said, "This is not fair." And the judge, I'll never forget this guy, his name was Randall Newsom. He stopped, hit the gavel. He says, "Mr. Reinhart, if you want fair, you got to go to God. You're not going to find it here." So I said, "Oh, handwriting's on the wall." I had thought about filing bankruptcy during this time, but I never did it. However, my partner did file bankruptcy and left me holding the bag, and ultimately I lost everything, even my beautiful home in the Oakland Hills where we had raised our 5 kids. I went from being a millionaire, multimillionaire actually, to being homeless and jobless and penniless. I remember telling Gail, babe, I don't think we can go any lower than this, and it was true. Now, while all this was going on, I became involved with planting Creekside Church. John Bruce, who was the minister of small groups at First Covenant Church in Oakland, had the vision of planting a church in San Leandro, and he asked Gail and I if we would be interested in joining him, and we were. Approximately 2 years later, in September of 1990, we were part of the planting team that planted Creekside Church here in San Leandro. And during the next 2 years after that, I still tried different ways to earn a living. I tried owning and operating a retail business. I tried doing real estate brokerage because I was a real estate broker. And I tried doing consulting. However, it didn't matter. Whatever I tried to do, nothing worked. I felt God closing door after door after door. And finally, an opportunity for me to go to work for Creekside Church full-time came up. And so I took it, and I have been here ever since. Now, I'd like to digress for a moment and go back to the time when I became a Christian. That was back in 1977. Immediately after committing myself to Christ, I went on an accelerated program of learning about the Christian faith. I would listen to radio broadcasts which featured prominent preachers. I did this nearly every day for well over 5 years. And one preacher that I was particularly interested in was John MacArthur. I would get his study books and use them diligently as I followed his daily broadcasts. I also did this with some other teachers like Charles Swindoll, Charles Stanley, and J. Vernon McGee. In addition, I received regular teaching at First Covenant Church, and I regularly attended several Bible studies. I also started leading my own Bible study, as well as various small groups, which I did for approximately 10 years. Needless to say, I accumulated a great deal of head knowledge. However, I was seriously lacking in heart knowledge. It wasn't until I went through the pain of my business failure that my growth as a Christian really began. When I lost everything, I realized that I was still that young boy who was essentially afraid of life. I was fearful of other people. I felt inadequate. I felt different. I felt like a failure. And I still felt alone. And I didn't know how to verbalize my feelings. And even if I could verbalize them, I didn't think there was anybody who would be interested enough to listen, not even Gail, as unimaginable as that may seem. And so I stuffed my pain. I put on good appearances. Everybody thought I had it together, but deep inside I was empty and hurting and dying. Now, I knew Jesus was a biblical character, and he really existed, but I never really understood the power of his message and his ministry. I thought that I was still responsible to change my own life, and that Christ would help me if I needed it, and if he wanted to. And at the same time, I realized that I didn't have any personal resources, so deep down inside, I felt a growing sense of hopelessness. When my business failed, I was stripped of everything. And that's when I got on my knees. And for the first time, I asked the Lord, what should I do? That's when my journey as a Christian really began. I began to see that he really wanted the best for me. I began to see that he had redirected my life for a purpose. I realized that he only looked at me with eyes of love and never disapproval. I was overjoyed as I began to understand these truths, because up to this point, I really didn't like myself very much. I always felt there was something wrong with me, because most of the important people in my life had either rejected me or left me. However, I could see that God had not rejected me and would not reject me. My progress in these areas accelerated when I got into Celebrate Recovery. That was 11 years ago. My senior pastor came to me one day and said that he heard about a recovery program called Celebrate Recovery. He asked me to check into it and see if it was worthwhile. So I ordered the materials and studied them intently, and I concluded that it had some merit. So I told my senior pastor that we should go ahead and implement it, and he gave me the green light. As I started leading Celebrate Recovery, I began to see that I was the one who really needed it. I needed to admit that I had a problem with rejection. I had a problem with abandonment and low self-esteem. In spite of all the progress that God had made in my life up to this point, I still had anxiety about relationships. I still believed that I was generally worthless, and that sooner or later people would find out and reject me. I had a fear of intimacy, and sometimes when I looked inside, I saw nothing of value. However, in Celebrate Recovery, I came to see that Jesus doesn't look at me that way. What made me finally understand that truth was the cross. I finally understood that Jesus willingly allowed himself to be tortured and killed so that the penalty for my sins could be paid, so that he could have a relationship with me. And he did that because I am valuable to him. I came to understand that Jesus really does love me, that he's always loved me. I came to understand that I have worth in the eyes of God of the universe. And that was a huge revolutionary idea, something that had never occurred to me before. I can't tell you how much it means to me today. Celebrate Recovery, I learned that Jesus wants me to love other people in the same way. This includes all people, even those who have rejected me or hurt me. I've also learned that I can do this, not in my own power, but because Jesus provides me the power to do that. Now, this has inspired me then to reach to others. As I have done that, I've experienced another benefit. I found out that I truly do love other people, perhaps for the first time in my life. My perspective of other people has changed. I no longer view them with suspicion. I don't have to worry about being acceptable or worthy to other people. Jesus loves me, and he's calling me to love others, and that's all that really matters. You know, love really does cover a multitude of sins. As I began to respond to the Lord, he began to cleanse me. And for the first time in my life, my quest for personal holiness started to bear fruit. My interest in money and power and prestige and other worldly pursuits began to diminish. I would like to say these things are all gone, but that is not true. Today, the Lord is working in my life still, and he's uncovering new areas where I need to commit those to him. One area in particular is the area of anger. This is an issue I've never really dealt with in the past, and I've had anger as a result of some of the things that have happened to me, but I've never really thought it was a serious problem. But in recent times, I've come to realize that it is, and that this is a new area of life for me that I have to turn over to him. And so I'm working on that one now, and that's turning out to be an interesting process. It's a struggle. I have to really keep myself in check. There's some things going on in my life right now, which I really won't go into, administratively here at Creekside, as well as in other areas of my life, that tend to make me very upset and angry. Once again, I'm saying it's not fair, but I remember the words of Judge Randall Newsom, you got to go to God. And that is absolutely true. That's what I have to do. And this is what the Lord is teaching me today. I know now that I can look to him for everything that I need in my life. And he satisfies me through my loving wife, my terrific family, and all the wonderful friends that he's placed in my life, and most of all, through his loving presence in my life. I would like to close with a verse that has come very meaningful to me. It comes from Galatians 2, verses 20 and 21, and it reads, "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." Thank you very much for letting me share. Thank you.
Would you please stand and recite the serenity prayer with me? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen.